to read off to you. So first is our recording disclosure. Please note that we are recording this workshop. If you would rather be anonymous or incognito, please turn off your camera. You may also change or remove your name. We are not recording content from any breakout sessions. Additionally, we ask participants to please honor the conference comfort agreements found on page 6 of your conference program or on our website. If at any time you need peer support, please visit www.peerpocalypse.com for a list of the on-call peer support specialists or the David Romprey Oregon Warm Line. We ask participants to keep themselves on mute. If you have any questions or comments for the presenter, please use the chat box. I am now, real quick, the presenter has given a suggestion that this presentation is best viewed in side-by-side mode. If you would like to find, if you aren't familiar with side-by-side mode, if you scroll your cursor over your screen, at the top you'll see a green box where it says whose screen you're viewing, and right next to it, it says view options. You can click on that view options and choose side by side. And with that, I would like to turn this over to Yehoshua Ventura, who is a peer at the Cascade AIDS Project, and whom I had the pleasure of meeting and training all the way back in 2017.
Yay. Long time ago. So my PowerPoint is on?
Yep. Okay. You're good to go.
Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can, Arthur Ashe. I wanted to start with this quote because it's something that kind of came along my way. I would say maybe like when I first moved up to the CAP Southwest Washington office, and considering that we're called peer navigators in Southwest Washington, it just kind of makes me think about spaces. But I've also started to use this quote a lot as a kind of self-care grounding tool, especially with all the things that are going on right now with COVID and the racial unrest and activism that's happening in our country, the political climate. In moments where I start to feel discouraged or like I have no power, I tend to kind of like say these 3 statements over and over again to help kind of get me grounded and to give me a focus of control. Again, so it's start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And welcome to Peer Navigating Presents Living with HIV from CAP Southwest Washington. Woohoo! I too have some comfort agreements. My presentation is as a peer and how I have understood this experience through my own life as well as the peers I support and navigate. This may not be your experience or what you know, but I present this to share and use it as information that can help you support your peers living with HIV. Big shout out to anyone in the room living with and or affected by HIV/AIDS. Hi. So my name is Yehoshua Ventura. I am the bilingual peer navigation coordinator. My pronouns are he, him, his. For anyone that is unfamiliar with the use of pronouns or if they're not being used in your agency, I just prompt you or encourage you to explore it a little bit and understand that they're a significant tool in our social justice language. Pronouns are important because their usage can impact safety, validate, and respect identity, and all identities. Pronouns empower. So this is a pic of my amazing agency that I work for, Cascade AIDS Project. This is in Portland during Gay Pride a few years back. And at our agency, we provide, in the Portland office, we provide services for people living with HIV. Those services include housing, also connection to mental health supports, various social and cultural supports, and then our peer navigation program. In 2012, Portland created its peer navigation program. And this program was kind of prompted by the Ryan White grants that we get, or monies that we get from the state to work with people living with HIV. The Ryan White grant stipulated that the areas of focus are on mental health, mental behavioral health, or substance misuse recovery. And the trainings that our peers got or get at Portland office kind of vary. It depends on what's available during the time. But like Jessica said, many of us were trained at MHAAO, and it was a really wonderful place to start this journey. The caveat of peers at working for HIV, for Cascade AIDS Project is that the majority of us, I think right now, all of us are living with HIV or AIDS. And several of us also have other areas of recovery that we exist in or live in. But that caveat is the biggest piece for our program, because in the whole concept that peers are able to share lived experiences, there is something very particular and unique to the experience of living with HIV or AIDS. And it really makes a big difference for those of us that are living with HIV/AIDS to have someone that we can work with that will understand the nuances, the struggles that are particular to our lives. And it's one of the programs that is starting to grow. Our Portland office has expanded the number of peers that it has. And we actually have 2 peers up in our Southwest Washington office. Where I moved up to in 2018, and I started the peer program in Southwest Washington. So we service Clark County, and then in 2019, we expanded up to Cowlitz, and we have an office in Longview where we also provide services for people living with HIV in that area. So we're hitting a really wide range of populations. We have some rural folks, we have some urban folks, and really like different demographic as well from the Portland office. I would say that the important thing to note for us working in Southwest Washington and Cowlitz is that we're working with a lot of people that are 50 plus. And I would say that the majority of the people that we work with are white people. So connecting with the Latinx community and the Black and African American community has been some of the work that in the peer program we've been trying to focus on and connect with the different groups in our area, because while we are not necessarily represented so much in the numbers, we are still a very big part of our community, and we're really working hard to bring that awareness to our agency and bringing it to the state as well. So peer navigating in Southwest Washington, Cowlitz. So like I said, we're called peer navigators, and it's a bit different than the work that, or I don't know, the term navigation was something that was really unique to me when I moved up to Southwest Washington office. I've been called a peer support specialist at Cap Davis. My traditional health worker certificate said that I was a peer wellness specialist. And so I think, you know, we all know that the range of peer work that exists out there is quite broad, and the things that we do are very different depending on agency and population that we work with. But when I moved up to Southwest Washington and the title navigator was given to me in peer navigation, it really impacted me. I'm a words guy. I like words a lot, and the word navigating and navigation just kind of like resounded super deeply within me. The idea of maps came up into my mind. The idea of terrain came up into my mind. The need for a compass, or the need for direction, the need for awareness around currents and weather and all the different things that happen when navigating or being a navigator. And so I kind of thought about those things and thought about how they were very similar to the human experience in life. And that the terrain that we cover is the terrain of our day-to-day. The currents that we cover are the currents, or we go through or navigate, are the currents that we experience going through life on a daily basis. And like weather patterns and all those different things like storms, clouds, thunder, lightning, natural disasters, they can all be overlaid into our human experience, and thinking that, you know, we can all describe different moments in our lives as disasters or thunderclouds or rainstorms, like, you know, correlating it to maybe like depression or anxiety or real crisis that we experience sometimes. So I really kind of went kind of all in with the navigation stuff, and most of the stuff that I work on in terms of like media is always focusing on maps and compasses and all that kind of stuff, just because I think it's a nice way to kind of like ground ourselves in the actual place that we are in. In our office in particular, because we are different, we are funded by Washington Department of Health. We don't have the same restrictions that the peers in the Portland office have for Ryan White. Whereas they are focused on mental health and substance misuse recovery, we are focused on medical engagement and med adherence. And so that shift in focus makes a big difference because we're not rushing to try to get them into a program. We're not rushing to push them into a recovery program that maybe they're not at all ready for. We are actually engaging them and supporting them in attending their doctor's appointments, making their doctor's appointments, having discussions around meds, and really kind of like sitting there with the conversations around not wanting to be med compliant and why, and what happens in our mental health, whether it's pill fatigue or sometimes we just go through mental health episodes where meds become kind of a reminder. And then on the other side of that, meds are vitamins, and meds are keeping us healthy, and meds are keeping us safe. And so trying to navigate the feelings around how we take care of ourselves as people living with HIV is important, because the other part that we really focus on in our office is this idea of intersectionality. Because while I am a person living with HIV, I am also queer identified, I am also Latino identified, I am also coming from a mental health recovery experience. And so it's so important for us to consider that all of our folks are coming with this kind of grid of intersection points that, depending on what their day looks like, is going to impact how they feel, and it's going to impact how they're able to access support and how they're able to connect to the resources that they need. So we really focus on thinking in a very trauma-informed and intersectional way, and really supporting our peers really in their leadership and empowering them to guide the work. We help our peers across different fields like medical, mental, legal, and other systems, which can often be barriers for us. And we provide equitable services to a community of people living with HIV in an area where it is, there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of homophobia. And even if you are not LGBTQIA plus identified and you have HIV, people will still lump you into that category, which can be challenging for many, especially if they're not of that group. So we've really thought about, you know, the people that we work with, how best to kind of meet them where they are, and then to really walk alongside them and support them on their journey. So now we're going to go into a little bit of my journey. I'm going to share a little bit about me. I come from the East Coast, and I was born in Long Island. I have like different like points in terms of like, you'll see on here, there's a map and they're like red circles, and I've just kind of like indicated like those red circles as different parts of my kind of history, my development, my past, and then also kind of indicators of where points of impact of trauma, you know, have hit me in my life. I was born in Long Island, New York. My mother abducted me at 1, and we bounced back and forth between New York and Connecticut throughout my early childhood. She married when I was 9, and we went to Connecticut, where we lived under the terror of an alcoholic, abusive stepfather, or her husband, which I call him. At 10, my mom sent me to El Salvador, and where I was unfortunate to experience a great deal of wartime trauma. And then when I graduated from high school, I left for New York City and for college and never looked back or never went back. And so with all those different things that were going on in my development, and I also came from a very Catholic upbringing. My mom's a very staunch Roman Catholic, also Latina. My home is Latino. My parents are from El Salvador. So there's a lot of machista culture in our home, and very patriarchal. And so it was a very challenging space to kind of start to realize that I was not heterosexual and that my sexual identity was different, and that also being an altar boy, and it was just kind of like taught to me that my sexual identity was actually a sin and that it was dirty and that I was going to go to hell. Which was really challenging for me because I believed myself then to be a really good person, and I tried to be better as I kind of went through. And the idea that I was just blanketly going to suffer these punishments for something that I had no control over really baffled me. The idea that there was a God that would punish me for being something that he created was also very troubling for me. So, you know, considering all the things that happened in my childhood, and then the sexual identity stuff that was going on, also the racial stuff that was going on, because the majority of my childhood I was living in Connecticut, and I was a Latino, and the majority of spaces that I went to for education were all primarily white. So I experienced a lot of racism, but I also experienced racism coming from my mom in the home against other people of color. And so it was a really tough place to be in terms of if you were other than. And so when I got to New York, that was a whole other ball of wax. I started to go through severe mental health episodes. All of the things that were happening in terms of identity and being away from home, and just like compounded with, you know, wanting to start like access to using drugs and access to a huge population of other LGBTQ people. I started engaging in risky behaviors. I started engaging in substance misuse, and but ultimately all that was in the effort of numbing myself from feeling any feelings around my sexual identity. And so that was a very rough period of time. That kind of continued through graduating undergrad and then working in New York City, and then finally testing HIV positive. So then after kind of testing HIV positive in New York and going through my experience, I'm going to touch back on that a little bit later. I moved to Miami, and in Miami, it was kind of like different and more challenging to navigate these feelings, which were already oppressive in New York City. And in Miami, you know, I had kind of established myself as an art therapist. I worked for the Miami-Dade County Public School System for 13 years. I also had a very huge, thriving practice working with families and couples using art therapy. I was making really good money. I lived in a really great place. I was involved in a very important spiritual community that was very different from my own growing up, and I was really starting to be able to repair my relationship with God. But I never really worked out what was going on in my head around living with HIV or being HIV positive. So one of the things that I experienced in my 13, 14 years in Miami was this like deep closet around my HIV status. And I was not aware of how that was impacting me. And so for, I would say probably like the last 5 years that I was there, my mental health just deteriorated like so much. And I kind of like passively tried to commit suicide several times by not taking my meds. That happened like 4 or 5 times. And I just was falling into a deeper depression, that was sleeping for, you know, the majority of the day, the majority of the week. And I had given up. All of a sudden, like, there was just kind of this like slight little thing in my head that was a little voice, and it was God's voice saying like, Portland, Oregon. And I was like, what the fuck, Portland, Oregon? What about Portland, Oregon? I don't know anybody in Portland, Oregon. I've never been to Portland, Oregon. Why are you telling me Portland, Oregon? And so over and over, that last 2 years that I was there, I just kept getting these messages over and over again about Portland, Oregon. So as my mental health deteriorated and as these messages became stronger, I decided that I was going to listen. And I packed all my shit up in a 23-foot truck, put my car on the back on a little trailer, and drove cross country from furthest point to furthest point, from Miami, Florida to Portland, Oregon. And I landed here in severe crisis. I had run out of meds. I didn't have any doctors situated. And I also hadn't calculated correctly for the amount of gas that I was going to have to pay because I didn't calculate my car in the back. So by the time I got here, I had 0. And I had to pay rent, and I had to do all the things, right? And so super crisis mode, super sick. And I called CAP, Cascade AIDS Project, and I went in for an interview or an intake. And in my intake, the person who was doing it, she said, "Oh, you're an art therapist." And I was like, "Yes." And she's like, "We have a job here. You'd be perfect for it." I was like, "What?" And she was like, "Peer support specialist." And I was like, "What's a peer support specialist? I'd never heard of that before." And she told me what a peer support specialist was, and I was like, "Okay." And so they hooked me up with the employment services program that was going on at the time. And that program kind of like worked with me on getting my resume together specifically for the job and doing my cover letter and filling out all the things. And that was in January. I got in here December 10th. In January, I had that intake. In mid-January, I had my first interview and second interview. And then in February, I started working at CAP as a peer support specialist. And that was crazy because, like I said, I had not at all been in a space where I felt comfortable with my status as a person living with HIV or my sexual identity. And I had put myself in a position that would be working with people living with HIV. So I remembered back in grad school when I was getting my art therapy degree, and at the end of the program, they always kind of like talk to you about like, what are the areas that you feel you would be really good at? And then what are the areas that you know you definitely don't want to work in? And so when they were asking me that question, I was like, the areas that I don't want to work in are 1, HIV, because I have HIV and I don't want to deal with it. 2, old people, because like I can't deal with mortality. 3, with addiction because of my alcoholic stepfather. Lo and behold, I find myself in a position where I'm working with all 3. And really crazy. And so when we were sent to our first training, we, with MHAO, we had been told that we needed to identify what area of recovery we were in. And everyone at the table was going around the table, and they were all kind of like sharing what area of recovery they were in and a little bit about their story. I was at the other side of the table, and as I was like kind of like thinking about it, I was starting to panic because I didn't know what I was going to say because I didn't think that I was in substance misuse recovery, and I didn't think that I was in mental health recovery, and I was starting to panic. But I was listening to everyone's story, and by the time they got like halfway through the table on the other side, I was like, holy shit, I'm in mental health recovery. Holy shit, I'm in mental health recovery. And when I realized that, it felt as if like these concrete slabs just kind of like lifted off me, and everything made sense. The idea that like, here I am, like I have a master's degree and on a professional level, I'm super successful, but in a personal level, my life was a hot mess. And why? Like I could never figure out like why I was able to do all these things in one area and be successful and be powerful, while in the other area just full of doubt, fear, and anger and emotional upset. And so that was kind of like the beginning of me coming into awareness around myself that would continue and continues to this day. Going in and working with people living with HIV, I had to find a compassion for them that I didn't have for myself. I had to hold space for a care and compassion for their lives in a way that I didn't have for myself. And I had to be encouraging around a life living with HIV when I despised mine. And in that process, in that holding of these feelings for these people, I had to start reflecting back on my own process and my own feelings around these things, because I'm a big believer of you can't ask others what you're unwilling to do yourself. And I felt like in order for me to be truly authentic in the services that I was providing these people, I really needed to do the work as well. So luckily, our program was founded on a very kind of like solid platform. We receive clinical supervision twice a month, once individually with a clinician, and then the second meeting is with the group, and it's all the peers at Cascade AIDS Project. And in that peer supervision, we are able to talk about all the different things that come up for us in working with our clients, and countertransference and all the kind of like heaviness, and making sure that we're maintaining our mental health kind of health and safety as we're dealing with some really hardcore situations. And so little by little, I started kind of like being able to be in a space where I could start to care for myself around living with HIV. And I could start to care for others living with HIV, and that stigma, that self-stigma that I had been like perpetuating on myself, was starting to be re-examined. So last fall, I went to New York City for a really good friend's wedding. And while I was there, I was hanging out in Brooklyn with a friend of mine. We were driving around in a car, and we were on Flatbush Avenue going back to the city. And as we're like stuck at a stoplight, I turn to my right and I see this building. And I'm like, oh my God. And then I just kind of like nudge my friend. I'm like, oh my God, look at that building. And she's like, what about it? I'm like, girl, that's the building where I tested HIV positive in 1998. And I was just kind of floored, because I was looking at this space where my world had completely just crashed, exploded, imploded, all of the things. I remember the day being in that horrible office after waiting 2 weeks for my exam to come back. I remember what it felt like to walk out of those doors and just kind of like, am I going to walk into this oncoming traffic, or am I going to go get fucked up, or how am I going to navigate these next few days, these next steps of what am I supposed to do? And here I am, 2019, like 20 years later, in front of this building, sitting in a cab, being as healthy as I ever have been, both on a mental health level and a physical level. And the reason is because I was able to grow into the person who I am today. And that was a big turning point for me in terms of the peer work, because if it hadn't been for me finding peer work and being hired as a peer, I would not be able to have had that moment. I think if I had seen this building without the experiences that I had, I think that would have probably sent me into a really, really bad mental health spiral. And because it just would have been an affirmation of just like all the loss, right? But in this experience, it was the complete opposite. It was actually reflecting back to me all the gains. And that was a mind fuck, because between thinking about like, the impact of what HIV had on my life, and then now thinking about the impact that I'm having on other people's lives, I just had to kind of like stop, think, and appreciate. So I would like to speak to you now a little bit about HIV/AIDS. I love this image because it's taking the AIDS ribbon and it's placing it in a way that creates an infinity symbol. And there's something really wonderful to me about that. Because it continues. HIV/AIDS continues. And I think that's kind of one of the biggest challenges that we have is that because the kind of energy or all of the things behind it have died out, you know, there isn't that same alertness around HIV or AIDS. There isn't that same activism necessarily, or that hasn't been around HIV and AIDS. And it's still here, we're still here. And the other thing that I like about this infinity symbol is that idea that we're still here. And so also the other thing is there's a big challenge in terms of how do I identify? Do I identify as someone living with HIV? Do I identify as someone living with AIDS? Because I have fallen into that space a few times in my life, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And then also the current space is that the majority of people are identifying as living with HIV. So we can all have like all these campaigns like end HIV or end AIDS, but neither of them is really kind of encompassing the whole, because there are many that are living with HIV, but there are also many that are living with AIDS. And I think it's important to think about that, because if you're working with peers that are navigating either of these experiences, it's going to be important to them in terms of how they identify. And the one thing that I really have a challenge with when we just select one over the other is that when you do that, you're literally stigmatizing the other or the one itself. And so I'm kind of always pushing for an awareness around both HIV and AIDS, especially in conversations around people that I'm working with, because it's important. Like, some people find a lot of empowerment in being able to say that they're living with AIDS and that they're still here. And they don't view it as this like horrible stigma word. They view it as something that they've been able to continue to survive. So I kind of wanted to put that out there and bring that to you as something to think about. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about more of the science. All right, so we're going to talk about HIV. And here is an image of our bloodstream, or our bloodstream. And so the happy red blood cells are there, and then you see the happy white blood cells, the CD4s. White blood cells, there are many different types, or there are 3 different types, I think, but the one that we focus on in HIV work or HIV/AIDS work is the CD4 cell. And what happens with HIV is that HIV gets into the body. So HIV are these green viruses. And once it's in the body, and how it gets in the body can come through many different ways. We know that it can be transmitted through sexual contact, through sexual fluids. We know that it can be transmitted through needle sharing. We know that it can be transmitted through blood. So any of the ways that the virus enters the system, it comes into the system. And once it gets into the system, it starts looking for the white T cells. And because this is what they use to reproduce. So the T cell attaches the HIV virus attaches itself to the T cell, into the membrane, and then moves into the cell and into the nucleus of the cell. In the nucleus of the cell, it takes over the DNA of the cell and converts it. And instead of making more cells, this cell is now being programmed to make more HIV virus cells. So once it does that, the cell starts to deteriorate and it eventually dies. And then the virus then becomes open and exposed to the bloodstream, and it goes into the bloodstream and it continues this cycle. So this is what we start to call viral load. Okay, so the amount of virus cells or viruses that are in a quantity of blood is called a viral load. And these are the things that we're looking for regularly for ourselves and for our peers. And so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit briefly about ART, which is the drug regimen that the majority of us are on that are living with HIV. And I'm also going to bring that conversation into PrEP. And PrEP is pre-exposure prophylactics. So that is a medicine that is being used currently with people that are HIV negative and engage in behaviors that may possibly expose them to the HIV virus. And so they basically work in the exact same way. The medicines impact the white or the T cells on certain levels, but the main one is on the outer nucleus or the cell membrane, where it stops any virus from attaching itself. And so when the virus can't attach itself to a white T cell, then it continues to live in the bloodstream, but it starts to diminish and it starts to die. And that is a wonderful thing because with HIV, one of the things that you've heard me mention a little bit already has been the idea of stigma. And even if we talk about like PrEP, and sexual health or sexual education, we're talking about stigma. And stigma is such an important dynamic of our work because it exists in so many different spaces. When we think about stigma, we have to think about like internalized and externalized stigma. We have to think about like the stigma that people are going to be facing when they go into the different systems that they have to go to, whether they're going to the doctor or whether they're going to any social services space to acquire some support. A lot of times when people identify themselves as living with HIV or AIDS, immediately there's a stigma that's like brought up with them that they're dirty, that, you know, the way that they got this also has connotations in terms of how people think we are. And then like that can then stop a lot of people living with HIV from accessing the services that they need. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of viral load and viral and CD4 counts, because these are kind of important things to consider also when working with people living with HIV. These are the numbers that kind of like, I don't want to say rule our lives, but are definitely numbers that kind of like we're constantly being told what these numbers are. And that can be really scary sometimes because the idea is that the more virus that's in our system, the more impact it has in the whole system. So we're talking the organs, we're talking the brain. And when it exists in areas like the brain, for example, HIV can actually have an impact on how the brain works and can create disturbances in the brain. And right now, I think it's being called HIV dementia, but even that term is kind of outdated because science is now starting to see that when HIV does impact the brain and mental health, it can present in a whole bunch of different ways. And then the other side is the CD4, which is our white blood cells. And that means that's how our immune system is managing. So I think that like anything above 500, I think is considered to be healthy. I think you want the higher, the better. Anything below 200, you fall into the AIDS zone. And that's a really important distinction. And this is something I want to like kind of present to you to think about because when you fall into AIDS zone, like that's a hard mental experience because essentially your medical file will say AIDS for the rest of your life. I've dropped down below 200, I think twice in my life, and I'm currently quite above 200. I'm not in the AIDS zone. But every time I look at my chart, it always says AIDS. And that does a brain fuck on me because, you know, here I am doing all the things, taking medicines, like doing, you know, taking care of myself, and I'm still considered AIDS. And then, so then I think about like, oh, well, that's kind of messed up too, because I'm viewing AIDS as a very specific, horrible thing. And then I'm making a judgment around AIDS, and that's messed up because that's again creating stigma. But I also have to acknowledge that for me, falling into that zone is threatening because it can be dangerous. When a person drops below 200 T cells, they are administered Bactrim, which is a type of antibiotic, and they remain on Bactrim with whatever else other meds that they're taking, but they remain on Bactrim until their T cells rise above 200. The reason that we have to take Bactrim during that period of time is because our body becomes super susceptible to anything, any infection. So like a common cold could turn to a pneumonia within us within days. And anything that would be light and our immune system would be able to cope with, because we have less than 200 T cells, or our immune system is super compromised, and we won't be able to handle it. We won't be able to bounce back from it. So we can fall into really dangerous and perilous circumstances and possibly fatal circumstances. So the Bactrim serves as a way to keep us kind of safe from those things. The Bactrim serves as a way to to fight those things because our system can't fight for us. The second thing, and we'll go into this a little bit later, is I talked about viral load, but I'm going to talk about an undetectable viral load, and that is the goal that we are shooting for these days, because with the use of art and PrEP as well, we are able, in our partners, we are able to diminish our viral load to below detectable. And that's really important because undetectable equals untransmittable. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people living with HIV don't know that. And so when you are able to be a person living with HIV and you are able to achieve undetectable status, there is a level of relief that comes to you because you are no longer thinking like, I'm going to infect somebody, I'm going to infect somebody, I'm going to infect somebody. So that's going to, play itself out in your relationships, especially in your partnerships. And because that's one of the things that's always going in our heads in terms of being someone who is infectious, right? The image that I'd shown before, this one is really important to me because you see the biohazard sign or symbol. There are actually a lot of people in the HIV community that have taken this symbol because we were kind of given that symbol during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. And we were considered biohazards, we were considered contagious. And so a lot of people in our community have actually taken that symbol and taken the power back by using it as a symbol of surviving. And for example, I know one person that every 10 years that he lives, he gets another biohazard symbol tattoo done to signify, and when I met him, he had 4. So he'd gotten it from the very beginning, and he's still here and he's thriving. So this idea of stigma and what that means for us living with HIV and how we navigate our relationships, how we navigate our feelings about ourselves can be really challenging. And so now that this scientific data has shown that undetectable is untransmittable, this has been a big game changer. And it's kind of opened up a brand new door for us to be able to live longer lives and normal lives and have relationships that are healthier. So with that, I think we're at time for a break. Jessica, are we at time for a break?
Yes.
All right.
So we'll go ahead and we'll take, what, 10, 15 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. We'll take 10 minutes for a break.
Okay, so
I will see everybody back here at 1:35. All right, welcome
Yeah.
back, everybody. I hope everybody had a great break, and take it away, Yehoshua.
Okay. So I just wanted to go over like some just definitions for folks out there in terms of what HIV and AIDS is and what it stands for. So HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. HIV is a virus like the cold or flu. A virus is nothing more than a set of instructions for making new viruses wrapped in some fat, protein, and sugar. Without living cells, a virus can't do anything. It's like a brain with no body. In order to make more viruses and to do all the other nasty things that viruses do, a virus has to infect a cell. HIV mostly infects CD4 cells, also known as T cells or T helper cells. These are white blood cells that coordinate the immune system to fight disease. Once inside the cell, HIV starts producing millions of little viruses, which eventually kill the cell and then go out to infect other cells. All of the drugs marketed to treat HIV work by interfering with this process. AIDS. AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It is a condition caused by HIV. And this virus attacks the immune system, the body's security force that fights off the infection. When the immune system breaks down, you lose this protection and can develop many serious, often deadly infections and/or cancers. They are called opportunistic infections because they take advantage of the body's weakened defenses. You have heard it said that someone died of AIDS. This is not entirely accurate since it is the opportunistic infection that causes the death. AIDS is the condition that lets the opportunistic infections take hold. So I just kind of wanted to read that because I think a lot of people don't even know what HIV is or what it stands for. And I'm talking about like us living with it, and also AIDS. And that I think I like this definition because it really emphasizes the fact that it is not, that it is like, it is a result of HIV, and that it is that it's very different from HIV. The other thing that I wanted to touch on before moving forward is kind of like thinking about trauma points and the trauma points that can happen as a result of this experience. So I think the first one I would say is testing HIV positive. and the trauma that that creates in a person's life. That diagnosis creates devastation in terms of life, dreams, hopes, and plans can be gone or obliterated in that experience. For myself, when I tested positive in 98, I was told by my doctor that I needed to start wrapping things up and that I needed to make a will and that I shouldn't make any sort of long-term plans. It is now 20 plus years later. Shalom, I'm here. And so that is a wonderful difference between testing positive back then and testing positive today, because of the huge amount of resources that there are for us living with HIV or AIDS. Other trauma points are the loss of relationships, partnerships, families, and the loss of hopes of children. And then also the loss of our health, our body, and our mind. And this could be impacted by mental health and substance use. It could be kind of like, that's also called infection rage. And infection rage is a dynamic where someone who tests HIV positive goes into a mental state of rageness around the fact that they were infected by someone that didn't disclose their status to them. And their response is to then try to go out and infect other people. So it is horrible, but it does exist, and it is a coping mechanism for some, and unfortunately it puts a lot of us and others at risk. And then finally, the impact of stigma. And stigma has been part of the HIV epidemic since the beginning. HIV-related stigma and discrimination refers to prejudice, negative attitudes, and abuse directed at people living with and affected by HIV. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to read you this poem. It's The Explorer by Kipling. And I'm going to go into an English accent because that's how I roll with this one. There's no sense in going further. It's the edge of cultivation. So they said, and I believed it. Broke my land and sowed my crop, built my barns and strung my fences in the little border station, tucked away below the foothills where the trails run out and stop. Till a voice as bad as conscience rang interminable changes, one everlasting whisper, day and night repeated so. Something hidden, go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges. Something lost behind the ranges, lost and waiting for you. Go. I love that poem. That poem came to me as I moved up to Southwest Washington and began to do peer navigation work. And it's kind of guided, again, that ethos of mine of navigating navigation. That there is a lot out there for us to find. And all we need to do is look for it. So I'm going to now talk about recovery. And as you see the image in front of you is that there are lots of winding roads. And as we all know that in different recovery spaces that we live in, the path is never linear. And then I wanted to kind of talk about specifically of what I'm calling HIV/AIDS recovery. It isn't like a definite term the way that mental health recovery or substance misuse recovery is, but it is something that I'm using and proposing to people to think about. Because when we think about HIV recovery or HIV/AIDS recovery, we're talking about so many different things that are happening at the same time. We're talking about like all the things that are happening with our bodies and our health. We're talking about all the things and how it impacts our mental health and behavioral health. We're talking about how it may lead to substance misuse as a way of coping, and any of the other things that may happen as a result of testing HIV positive. And then also like the idea that we always kind of want to like define things, right? Like we're always like, oh, no, I'm in mental health recovery or I'm in substance abuse recovery. It's like, no, I think like, again, like what I brought up initially around the idea of intersectional thinking or working in an intersectional way is that it's the idea that like all these things are happening and they're all happening at the same time within this person or you. and that we need to keep that idea open, because the work that we do with our peers will be multi-layered. And you know, I also want to talk about, or kind of point out, or put it into the group, is I am surprised that we're the only person, or the only agency that's presented on living with HIV/AIDS. We presented last year and presenting this year, thank God. And but I can't imagine that like peers out there that are working with peers are not working with peers that are living with HIV. And if you are, like, what is that like for you as an experience if you're not living with HIV? And then what if they are living with HIV and they aren't telling you? That's a big question, because if you have a caseload and not one person is living with HIV, I don't know. And then if they're not telling you, it's because of stigma, and they're afraid to tell you that they're living with HIV because they're afraid of losing the support that you're bringing to them in their lives. So something that I'd like to propose to you as a peer to think about, like, you know, am I working with people in these spaces? If I don't have anyone on my caseload, why? And is that really accurate? And then moving forward into this idea of science and undetectable equals untransmittable, this is another really huge thing to know and to and talk about with your peers that are living with HIV, in hopes that they do know what this means. Because like I said before, it's a game changer. And it really gives us an opportunity to have healthy lives. With the reduction of HIV in our system, it means that our organs aren't impacted so strongly, that our immune system is able to do the things that it needs to do. And then the other part that's starting to change for us, and it's also impacting our quality of lives, is the development of HIV/AIDS meds. We have gone through a series and a history of HIV/AIDS meds that started off in the 80s, and AZT, and the most horrible side effects, and, you know, death from either AZT or AIDS, and really just like having to take millions of pills during the day, throughout the day, and just like impacting your quality of life so that you're nothing but like taking pills. And then to today, where we have all these different medicines that are combining different medicines within one pill. The emotional labor around taking all the pills versus one pill is very different. Also, the new meds are really taking into consideration like co-occurring things that are happening in our bodies. Like I said, a lot of us, there's a huge population of people that are 50 plus now that are living with HIV because they didn't plan on being here. We're all here still. And so that means that all the things that happen with aging are also happening within the context of HIV. And one of the things that HIV does that I want to make sure that y'all know is that it does accelerate kind of our aging. Because of the kind of like strength of the medicines that have been, you know, created in the past, their impact on our organs, their impact on our systems is to age us faster than we do normally. And so with that, and the kind of like, and the actual aging, then we're talking about things like diabetes, or high blood pressure, or high cholesterol, or heart conditions. These things are happening while also living with HIV. So, and let's also talk about mental health and psychotropic medications that are being prescribed to us. It's super important for you to help your peers advocate for conversations with their providers to make sure that meds are able to be taken together. Sometimes prescriptions are given to our people in silos, and so one doctor may give them something for their heart, another doctor may give them something for their HIV, and then their behavioral health care provider will give them something for their mental health. And none of them are checking in with each other, and none of them are actually checking to see if there is any sort of conflict with those meds. And sometimes those conflicts do happen, and they can really impact a person's body. So when talking to people living with HIV, and if you're able to get into a conversation around how they're managing their meds, you know, that's a really good thing to talk about. You know, and then the other thing is like, do they feel comfortable having these conversations? So a big part of our work is to go with our peers to their medical appointments. It's really supportive for them. It helps them to feel safe. And it's also a way for another set of ears to be there when listening to information that sometimes is really challenging to hear or listen to. I know for myself, when I go into my appointments and the doctor starts saying all the things, like going through my blood work, like it turns into Charlie Brown teacher, like, and I'm like, uh-huh, 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 uh-huh. And that's it, right? Because I'm experiencing a micro trauma, right? Because I don't know any of these things that they're talking to me about. And I think that's an issue, right? I think that the fact that we go into our medical appointments and they go through these lists of things and we're like, okay, okay, okay. But the reality is that like, we really don't understand how that impacts our body, or so most of us. I don't think that I think a lot of people can be educated, but I know for a lot of the folks that I work with, and I know that like for myself, going into those medical appointments and for them going through my blood work, it's just a real challenge. And so there's that. And so then I can be there as their peer and sit there and hear some of those things that maybe they just can't hear in that moment. The second thing is that like I can say like, hey, remember you wanted to ask about blank? Or hey, remember you wanted to ask about your sexual libido and how that's kind of like diminished or disappeared since you started taking these meds and how that's impacting your mental health, and you know, you wanted to have a conversation around that. And then, you know, being able to open up the conversation around sexual activity, because again, that's a really challenging one for people living with HIV. So the more that we can be there to prompt and open up these conversations, the more that we can be there to support our peers in having such incredible conversations with their healthcare providers, and also advocating for themselves to get what they need. Not just listen to the doctor as the expert, because the true expert in that room is the peer. The true expert is the person sitting there because they know how it's impacting their lives. They know how their bodies feel. They know how their minds feel, how their brains feel. They know how their hearts feel. And they're the people that we should be listening to. But unfortunately, we live in this like oppressive system that sometimes pushes us to do things and to hear things and to follow things that maybe aren't necessarily the right thing for us. So, you know, we all know that as peers, like we're constantly fighting for advocating for ourselves and for the people that we work with. But in this particular space, I want to make sure that you consider that in working with people living with HIV, because the medical appointments are really challenging, and your assistance in that space could mean a whole world of difference. And the other thing is that we're teaching our peers how to do those things, right? We're teaching them how to engage in these like really hard or difficult conversations, but feel comfort in that. And so that eventually they're going to be the ones who are going to bring that stuff to the appointments, and we're just sitting back and we're just watching, right? And supporting that. But we need to help them get to that point. And so that means going to the appointments with them whenever possible, and kind of like destigmatizing this whole medical experience. Okay, so in our office, we had a big, well, I had a big challenge with this concept of U equals U initially, because what I feared around it was that like I know a lot of people that are not going to be able to achieve undetectable status. I know people that fall within the AIDS status and that they're just never going to be undetectable. And I feel like the last thing that our community needs is another way to stigmatize people within our community. So if I'm not undetectable, then I can't even participate in this kind of like feeling around like, because everyone's like, U equals U, U equals U. So we had a big debate about this in the office, and then the housing manager at the time, she kind of yelled over her cubicle. She yelled out, viral load does not equal value. And I turned around and I was like, oh my God, yes, that is so important. Viral load does not equal value, because U equals U is based on the viral load and whether our viral load is undetectable or not. And so for those folks that are unable to reach undetectable status, you know, we don't want them to feel like they are being measured, their values being measured by their viral load. And so then I created this artwork kind of like pushing back against the U equals U concept as a general thing, because I also think that in order to achieve undetectable status, there are so many things that are contributing factors. Like we have to think about whether they have housing, stable housing, whether they have proper nutrition, how is their mental health, are they substance engaged, like do they have a community of people that are supporting them and that they can access, like all these things. And then just like real practical things that come into like, you know, can I, if I don't have a home, how am I keeping my meds? Where am I keeping my meds? Is taking my meds every day going to even be a priority for me? And that is a question that comes up for a lot of folks, both in our houseless population and also our trans-identified folks. Because a lot of them, their main focuses are on where am I sleeping tonight, where am I eating, and then also the challenges and barriers that they have in terms of trying to get an income. So for a large group of our clients in our population, in our community, the undetectable is not going to be reached. And so we really push forward this, like, be at your best health, the level of health that you can achieve, the level of health that you are desiring, and then how can we support you in that process. So like I mentioned a little earlier, I tested in '89, and so when I moved here, I discovered that I'm a long-term survivor. I had never heard that term before, and I don't necessarily resonate with that term so great. Like I just don't feel like that, like in terms of long-term survivor. But a lot of people find a lot of strength in that. There's a lot of community in that. So to this point, I just kind of want to point out that, like, please give your peers the space to find who they are. Please don't assume that they're going to want to be called any of the things, right? Like, ask them what they want, the same way we want to ask them what their pronouns are and how they prefer to be identified. We also want to ask them, how do you want to identify? Are you living with HIV? Are you living with AIDS? Are you a long-term survivor? Does that feel good to you? Because again, we're looking for putting the power back into their hands. But so I kind of, again, shifted this idea of long-term survivor to more than surviving. And because, to be honest, I feel like this is an accurate representation of this generation. We are more than surviving, and we are able to be alive for a normal amount of time. We're able to reconnect to long-term plans and long-term goals and long-term dreams. And so we are moving forward through surviving and into, you know, having our best lives that we can possibly have. So I just kind of wanted to bring that forward as something to think about when dealing with the people that we work with. So now I'm going to share with you a little bit about the tools that we've used in our office. One of the biggest things that we've emphasized is the idea of connection. I think one of the biggest threats to those of us living with HIV or AIDS is isolation. And whether that isolation is coming from, like, because you just don't feel safe in the environment that you live in to talk about your status or your health. And then also, again, that, like, self-stigmatizing isolation where we pull ourselves out of spaces like relationships, friendships, all those different things, because we don't have the energy or the ability to communicate our life experiences in this way. So connection has been some of the things that we've been like, or connection is one of the things that we're super focused on. And about 3 years ago, our office received a grant from the Department of Health in Washington State to work on a stigma project. So our first stigma project consisted of different events throughout the year that addressed different topics around HIV. So the first one was about living with HIV in Vancouver and Southwest Washington. The second one was U equals U science over stigma, and Ladies Night, because the women living with HIV or AIDS have a very specific and particular experience. It's very different, and it's important to recognize them. Unfortunately, they are also the group that is still rising in infection rates, particularly in girls, young women. And I think that part of that is because of stigma of getting tested, stigma of accessing sexual health support by being able to get contraceptives or anything that could help prevent, or any prevention tools. And then the last one was for long-term survivors. This fight's still not over. Because like I said before, while it may not, that term isn't something that I necessarily connect with, but a lot of people here in the Pacific Northwest do. And I found that to be a source of power for them. It's a source of community for them. And it's a very specific dynamic that I'd like you to think about, because for a long-term survivor, you're talking about a dynamic of a person that's been coming from a place of the AIDS epidemic, where they've seen their friends, their families just completely just disappear, to die left and right. And for them to still be surviving creates a lot of challenges. We have long-term survivor issues and mental health challenges that come out of that. We have survivor's guilt that comes out of that. And then also, just like thinking about like on an economic standpoint, is that these people also were told you are not going to live. So many of them cashed out their, retirement or their IRAs if they had that. Any savings that they had, they cashed them out. Unfortunately, a lot of them also spent their savings on the initial HIV meds because insurances weren't covering it and the government wasn't doing anything to help people in this space. So they spent all their money and thought that, they were going to die soon. And here we are 20, 30 years later, and they are in really challenging spaces because of the loss of their money, of their loss of their income, of their loss of giving up all these different plans or careers that they were involved in. And then, put on, or engaged in the system of disability with Social Security, and then being on a really limited income. And then having all these other things like life continuing to happen, and now their friends are doing all these things, and they're kind of like stuck in this space of like, I'm living with HIV or AIDS. I am on a limited income. I can't really afford to go out and do anything. I can't go out to dinner. I can't go out to movies. And then what that means in terms of their relationships with their friends. And then what that does to their own self-esteem and self-worth feelings. It's a really challenging dynamic. So with these folks, think about that. Think about like these dynamics that are happening in whatever space that you're working with them with as a peer. So then the second year we got awarded another grant for the Stigma Project, and this one I took on to lead, and I called it Stigma 2.0 Intersecting. And we got a good amount of money. I applied, I think I got like $2,000 from the state. And with that, I wanted to focus on some things that I felt were community building. The first one was I would have dinner parties, and peers or clients would be able to sign up for our dinner parties. And in these dinner parties, I would have them catered by different spaces or places in the area in Vancouver, and then we would have dinner conversations. And so the conversations talked about intersectionality. We had a specific one for people of color. We talked about sexual health and sexual education. We talked about self-care practices, and we talked about aging well. And so that was a really wonderful way to start creating moments of community, because in Vancouver and in Washington in general, I would say that because of the homophobia and stigma that exists, a lot of people that live in this area or live in the Vancouver area would come down to the Portland metro area, hang out and do all their stuff in the Portland metro area, and then go back into their homes and like isolate in Vancouver. And then once they tested HIV, that isolation became even more extreme. So to bring them in, to have them at a table, to feed them food, and to be part of this be at my table experience and have these amazing conversations really allowed them to start to have community for the first time in Southwest Washington. And that was awesome. The second part that was part of this program was I started a peer art therapy group where we used different art making techniques to kind of like explore these themes. So like in this one, you see, this is where we were like exploring intersectionality. So I had all the peers kind of like identify all the different spaces that they lived in or that they felt represented them, and then they created artwork about that. For our people of color art therapy group, we talked about like what the difference was, you know, as a person of color navigating these systems, what it was for us to be engaging in sometimes really oppressive experiences with white doctors or white systems that just, you know, weren't necessarily giving us the care because of their oppression. And then talking about what were the things that we could do to empower ourselves in these spaces, to be able to get the things that we need and the help that we needed and the treatment that we needed. So this is one of the pieces that one of our peers did in that. Sexual health was a really fun conversation to have because like I said, a lot of our folks are 50 plus and a lot of them are having a lot of challenges around using the hookup and dating apps because of the language of emojis. And so we explored the language of emojis in sex and what the different emojis stood for. And that was a really fun one because obviously there's some really fun conversation that could be had with these things. And then we kind of moved forward and I prompted the peers that were participating to create their own emojis and talk about like what their emojis represented. That year was our last year of receiving the stigma grant, unfortunately, but our director in our office had seen the powerful effects of the peer groups and was in full support of them. So she asked me to consider continuing to do the work, and I created this idea of Peer Navigating Presents. And what I did with this is we did two different groups initially. The first one was social. We would meet every Thursday from 5 to 7, or 5:30 to 7, and we would socialize. Whereas I didn't have the money to do the dinners anymore, I was able to put out a little spread of good snacks and beverages and stuff like that. And this one was really cool because I transitioned from being like the facilitator in the Stigma Project 2.0 group to really pushing peer-led group. So I no longer was like really trying to navigate what the conversations were or what we were going to talk about. I really opened it up to having the peers bring in what they wanted to do. And that would start in with our check-in. And generally our check-in would kind of like generate the conversation for the night. And so we would talk about whatever came up. And that could be about sex, that could be about relationships, that could be about the challenges around like even being able to participate in the groups because some of our members have children. And all the different things that are happening in our lives. Again, that intersectional idea that like HIV is not everything in my life. Like there are lots of other things that are happening and that I have to consider and think about when talking about these things. The second group that I started was Explore. This group is, I call it Explore Our Creative Journey. And that was kind of like a continuation of the Peer Art Therapy group. I changed the title to be a little more trauma-informed from Peer Art Therapy to just Our Creative Journey because I was noticing that a lot of my peers were feeling feelings around every time I said Peer Art Therapy. And to take that stigma away, you know what I mean? Also to take the expectation away, we just went with creativity because everyone can create. There's no right or wrong in art, but there's absolutely no right or wrong in creativity. So we went with that. And then once COVID times hit, we had to transition. Our entire staff was sent home and we were working remotely. My manager and my director asked me to continue doing these groups via Zoom, which is how I got this lovely background and setup. There's a whole stand that comes with it. And because I felt like if I'm going to be doing this, if I'm going to be doing groups online and via Zoom, that I wanted it to be intentional. I didn't want just like the back of my apartment to be showing. I wanted them to know that I was thinking about this space, this the virtual space, and that this was going to be an intentional space, that this was the environment. I was creating an environment for us. And then they also asked me to think about expanding my groups to including more, because these groups have a pretty consistent following. I've got for the in-person groups, I was getting between 7 to 9 regularly. And this is now my 3rd year of working with these people. So like these people were coming regularly. We were doing really good work. Everyone was supporting each other. They were exchanging phone numbers. One night I got like a whole series of pictures. They had all gone out after group and gone to downtown Vancouver and were hanging out. And like, again, like I'm saying, this is the first time that our folks in Southwest Washington have been able to have a space where they can be together in this way. So in creating a more client-centered or client-facing group, I created CapChat. And CapChat has been super fun, CapChat Quarantine Times. And in CapChat Quarantine Times, I've invited several different people to come on as my guests. And then I do kind of like an informal conversational interview with them. And the audience is comprised of clients in our community and also staff members. So in a trauma-informed way to think about how clients can see staff and staff can see clients in a more general way, like if they have to come into the office or to be into an event. Whereas now we've been also isolated in this remote working, that I thought like here would be a good opportunity for people to be able to see each other. And so I've had different people on CapChat. We've specifically been talking about COVID and quarantine times and like what that's been like. I've had people from Columbia River Mental Health, Family Medicine Southwest, Clark County Department of Health, and we've all talked about like, what are the things that we're doing to navigate COVID? How are we managing the bombardment of media? How are we managing going out and getting supplies? What are our feelings around wearing masks or gloves? What are our feelings around seeing people that are not wearing masks? And then when the racial unrest happened with the murder of George Floyd and the coming out of all the different people that have been victims of police brutality, that just hit our entire country. And I felt like it was important to also talk about that, because I felt like I couldn't continue running these CapChats and just focus on COVID when this whole other thing is happening and it's just as important. And so now the conversations that have been happening are really a combination of COVID, phasing, the phase back, and what looks like a possible phase back, and then and all the navigating all the different feelings of racial unrest and racial activism and white fragility and all the things, and how we're negotiating these things in such a challenging time. So these are the 3 groups that are currently going on in our space, and we're really, again, continuing to build community in this way. But what's also awesome is that a lot of, well, specifically 2 of our folks that couldn't come because they couldn't get childcare are now able to participate. And in that, we know that like when we do move back into being able to provide in-person services, that groups will be held in our space, but we'll also keep the Zoom part as part of it, so that people that can't be there physically can actually still participate via Zoom. So that is one discovery that's been really awesome that we've been able to make.
Yehoshua?
Yes.
I don't want to interrupt. Oh, you're closing. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So needless to say, all these things that I've been able to do, all these things that I've been able to work on have pushed me into a new space in my life of activista. I am always promoting our program, our peer program. I love being a peer. This is me up in Spokane at a conference about U equals U. And I made this little piece of artwork to talk about, like, once I was negative, then I tested positive, and then I went on this crazy journey that took me all over the place and backwards and forwards and trauma. And somehow throughout this entire journey, I found my treasure. I found myself. So I'm gonna end with this poem. I know we're trying to leave some time for questions, but I'm gonna end with this poem because I love this poem. I send this poem out to you, all the peer workers that are out there that are listening today. I'm going to read it to you. It's a poem by Adrian Michael Green, who's a poet from California, and it's called Only Only. You are the one, the only, the expectation and the expected, the sure and the certain, the root and the sun. You pull and lure and hold and ease and open, you open, you open, you open, you. Oh, you aren't just anyone. Not one other soul, no matter how hard they try, can deep like you, empath like you, gift like you, gorgeous like you, humble like you, create like you, love like you, attract like you, heal like you, energy like you. You are the one, the only one. Those are all my peers. You are the one. Okay, so Jess, do we have any questions?
So, yeah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. I know we did have a question about earlier on before you addressed it. We had a question about the medications used for HIV and AIDS and how do they interact or might they interact with mental health medications. And so I think you talked about that.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions.
Okay.
Anyone? I'm scrolling through the screens. I don't see any. All right. Well, thank you for attending this workshop. Thank you, Yehoshua, for an amazing, really amazing workshop. I'm so excited that I could attend. And there are a ton of comments in here if you want to look them over. Oh, I do see there's one question.
Okay.
It says, what is missing in peer work for people with HIV/AIDS? And what else would you like funding for?
What is missing in peer work? I'll say that what's missing is more peers living with HIV. Even in like my agency and then other agencies in Portland, trying to hire peers that are living with HIV is really challenging. And sometimes peers are hired that are not living with HIV. And while they're effective as a peer, that one caveat makes a huge difference. So, you know, like I also have a peer, like I said before, like I believe like I can't ask of others what I'm not willing to do myself. And so I have a peer, and the last peer that I had actually was HIV negative, but I noticed that like while I still did a lot of work with her, I noticed that like the things that I wasn't working with her were really clear. There were all the stuff around HIV. There were all the stuff around the meds. They were the conversations that I was having with my previous peer who was living with HIV that we were like, that's the work that we were doing. We were talking about that. We were working on that. So I would say that that is a big piece. I think funding would be, again, for FTE credits to have more peers, but then like, I really would like to be able to do these dinner parties again. I would like to kind of expand on that. I would like to give our community more of an opportunity. I would like to provide childcare with funding. I would like to provide food with funding, and I would like to provide transportation with funding. Those are the three areas that I think that I would focus on if I were able to get some money.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing.
And then the question is, how is your supervision as a peer with HIV/AIDS? My supervision is awesome. We have a clinical supervisor, and he has just taught us so much. The coolest thing about him was that when we interviewed him to see if he was the right fit for our crew, he said to us, I am not a peer, I am a clinician, but working with you, I understand how important that power differential is. So I'm going to push myself to be as peer as possible within the work that I'm doing with you. And he has done a really good job in terms of meeting us where we are as peers and helping us to manage all the difficult things, because we do, deal with things like having our peers pass and, and what that does for us. And then like when our peers go through crisis, or when their peers go through lapses or relapses, and what that impact is, or when they start to make choices that are going to impact their housing, or any of those things that we start to worry about for them. And then also having to learn these self-care techniques about like, okay, like I'm done, I can't take this home, I can't keep thinking about this at home, how do I take care of myself in that way? Really kind of tapping into kind of like that self-worth, that self-value piece in terms of like how I got to this place in the first place. And, is that stepping in front of my ability to be mindful in terms of taking care of myself? So he does a really good job at being able to do those things. Oh, so actually I will amend to the other of the funding question. I would have all peers receive supervision. And not talking about your caseload and not talking about like the practical stuff. I mean, you can do that too, but I really wanted to make sure that it would be supporting the peers in their journey. Responsible to, not responsible for. My colleague peer, Doug, just wrote that in the chat box, and that was one of the things that our clinical supervisor taught us, and it's been one that Doug and I have been bouncing around a lot for, because it's been very challenging to understand. I kept going into clinical supervision. I was like, can you talk about that responsible to versus responsible for thing? And that's been a big tool, because I am responsible to provide peer services and support to my peer. I am not responsible for the choices that they make or the situations that they put themselves in as a result of their choices. And I think for those of us in this profession, helping, using the word help as opposed to, like we really want to use support, like we really be mindful around the, like the boundaries that we have. So I think this responsible to versus responsible for has been a big part of our thing. Do you think we need a separate training program for peers with HIV/AIDS for peer support? I think that all peer programs should include some HIV/AIDS training. Again, like I think that if anyone has a caseload that doesn't have a person living with HIV, I'm kind of surprised by that. But I think that is something that should be kind of like brought up in a general training. And then I think for people living with HIV that are coming in as a peer, I think they also need like a good amount of support around that work as well. Anything else? That's my mantra. The word empower. Someone asked a question about the word empower. Did I use the word empower in a weird way?
I didn't hear it.
Okay.
Maybe it's a general question.
The word empower instead of, oh yes, empower. Yes, I like that. Yes, instead of even support, to empower. Right, because I love that. The whole idea of like, breaking down the power structure and empowering our peers to be able to be more at a level with us, so that they don't have that barrier of the power. So that's a good one.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us in this fantastic presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your peer apocalypse. I know we will, and we can't wait to see you all in person again.
Woo!
Woo! All right. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.